The rope was already around Dexter Bishop's neck when Ada Winslow rode her horse straight through the crowd gathered in the square at Cedar Bend. She did not slow at the edge of the townsfolk the way a careful woman might have. She drove her mare, lathered white with a night of hard riding, between two freight wagons and a knot of loggers who scattered cursing, and she did not stop until the animal's shoulder nearly struck the base of the gallows platform itself. "Cut him down," she shouted, and her voice cracked from a night without water. "Cut him down, I have proof this man did not kill Mr. Whitfield." Judge Corwin, standing beside the hangman with his thumbs hooked in his waistcoat, looked at her the way a man looks at a fly that has landed in his coffee. "Miss Winslow, this is a lawful proceeding. You will remove yourself." "I will not." Ada swung down from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped, stumbling on legs gone stiff from 6 hours in the stirrup, and pulled from inside her coat a folded oilcloth bundle. Her hands shook as she opened it, not from fear but from cold and exhaustion, and she held up a hunting knife with a bone handle, the blade still dark along the fuller where blood had dried and never been properly cleaned. Scratched crudely into the bone, worn but visible if a man looked, were 2 letters. J and M. "I found this buried under the ferry landing at Winslow's Crossing, wrapped in a feed sack. Not 4 days past," she said, loud enough now that the crowd had gone still to hear her. "And I saw Jasper Merrow crouched at that same landing at first light, the morning Mr. Whitfield was found dead upriver, washing his hands and his shirt cuffs in the current like a man trying to get something off him that would not come off easy. I did not understand what I was looking at then. I understand it now." A murmur went through the crowd like wind through wheat. Up on the platform, Dexter Bishop stood with his hands bound before him, a rope around his neck, 3 days of stubble on a jaw that was clenched so hard she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He was looking at her the way a drowning man looks at a rope thrown a half-second before he goes under for the last time, and something in that look struck her harder than she expected it to, harder than any stranger's face had struck her in a long while. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Winslow," Judge Corwin said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Jasper Merrow is the son of one of this county's finest citizens." "Then this county's finest citizen can explain why his son's knife was buried at my crossing with a murdered man's blood dried into the fuller," Ada said. "Or your court can hang an innocent man to save itself the trouble of asking." From the edge of the crowd, a heavy-set man in a fine gray coat and a hat too clean for a timber town pushed forward. Silas Merrow's face had gone the color of ash under his gray whiskers, but his voice, when it came, was steady and practiced, the voice of a man who had talked his way out of worse rooms than this one. "This is a farm woman's fancy, Judge. Grief makes people see things. Everyone knows the railroad man was seen arguing with the inspector the very night he died." "I was not seen arguing with anybody," Dexter said, and it was the first time Ada had heard his voice, low and rough from the rope already cutting a line into his throat. "I was seen walking the grade with him because it was my job to walk the grade with him. I am the Northern Pacific Scout for this section. I found the timber counts did not match what your mill was billing, Mr. Merrow, and I told Whitfield, and 2 days later Whitfield was dead, and somehow I am the man swinging for it." "Enough," Judge Corwin said, though he did not sound like a man in command of his own courtroom anymore. He looked to the sheriff, a lean, weathered man named Tate who had stood through the whole proceeding with his hat brim low and his jaw tight, saying nothing. "Sheriff, what do you make of this knife?" Tate stepped forward and took it from Ada's hands, careful, turning it in the gray autumn light so the initials caught. He had known Jasper Merrow since the boy was small enough to ride a pony bareback through this same square. Ada watched something settle in the sheriff's face, some old debt of conscience finally called due. "I make it that we do not hang a man on a Tuesday morning that we might have to apologize to on a Wednesday," Tate said slowly. "Cut him loose, Judge. We will hold him in the jail while this is looked into proper, and we will send for the circuit marshal out of Ellensburg to take testimony from Miss Winslow himself. That is the lawful way, and it is the way we are going to do it." There was a long moment where Judge Corwin looked at Silas Marrow, and Silas Marrow looked back at him with something cold and warning in his eyes, and the whole square seemed to hold its breath waiting to see which way the scale would tip. Then the judge, perhaps remembering that 100 witnesses stood in that square and any one of them might carry word to a territorial court someday, gave a curt nod. "Cut him down," he said. "But the marshal will have his say, and if this woman's evidence proves false, Sheriff Tate, you may explain to me why you interrupted a lawful execution." The hangman, looking relieved to have an excuse not to pull his lever, climbed the platform and sawed through the rope with his belt knife. Dexter's knees buckled the moment the pressure came off his neck, and 2 men from the crowd, strangers to Ada, caught him under the arms and eased him down onto the platform steps. He sat there working air into his lungs in long, ragged pulls, and when he lifted his eyes to find her again in the crowd, there was something raw and unguarded in his face that made her chest ache in a way she had no ready name for. "Thank you," he said, when he could manage words. "I do not know you, ma'am, but you have just given me back the rest of my life." "I know," Ada said, and found she did not know what else to say to that, so she said the practical thing instead, because practical things were what she understood. "You will want water and something warmer than that coat. It is a long ride back up to the crossing, and the light will not hold past for this time of year." He almost laughed, though it came out as more of a rasping cough. "You rode through the night to save a man you had never met, and now you are worried about the length of my coat." "Somebody ought to worry about something practical," she said. "You have clearly stopped." Sheriff Tate insisted on the formalities even so, and Dexter spent 2 nights in the Cedar Bend jail, while Tate sent a rider east over the pass road to Ellensburg for the circuit marshal. A man named Reeves who was, by all accounts Ada had heard, not a man who could be bought by timber money the way Judge Corwin plainly had been. Ada gave her sworn statement twice, once to Tate and once, 3 days later, to Marshal Reeves himself when he arrived road-weary and skeptical, and both times she told it the same way, plain and without embellishment, because she had learned in her 24 years that the truth needed no decoration to be believed by an honest listener, only the courage to keep saying it in front of people who wished it were not true. Reeves took the knife into his own custody, along with a torn page of surveyor's notes Ada had also found near the ferry landing, notes in Whitfield's own hand describing discrepancies in the Marrow mills, billing to the Northern Pacific Railroad for timber and pilings used in the Stampede Pass grade. It was not, Reeves said carefully, quite enough yet to arrest Jasper Marrow outright, not with Judge Corwin's court likely to throw out any charge Silas Marrow's money could reach, but it was enough to release Dexter Bishop from all suspicion, and enough, he told Ada privately, to make him very interested in the Marrow family's books. "You have made yourself an enemy of a powerful man, Miss Winslow," Reeves said to her on the courthouse steps, tipping his hat before he mounted to ride back east. "I would watch that crossing of yours closely between now and when this pass shuts for winter. Men like Silas Marrow do not forget who humiliated them in a public square." "I have watched that crossing alone for 2 years, Marshal," Ada said. "I intend to go on watching it." It was Dexter Bishop, standing a few feet away with his hat in his hands, and his throat still marked with a raw pink line where the rope had bitten, who spoke next, and his words settled over her like a weight she had not asked to carry. "Not alone," he said. "Not this time." Ada turned to look at him properly for the first time since the gallows, now that he had shaved and slept and eaten, and found a man perhaps 30 years old with a scout's weathered squint at the corners of his eyes, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent years in a saddle and on foot through hard country, and a jaw that was set now with a stubbornness that matched her own. "I did not ask for an escort, Mr. Bishop," she said. "No, ma'am, you did not. But you rode through the night with a murder weapon in your saddlebag to save the life of a stranger, and I do not intend to let you ride home alone to a crossing that man wants for himself, not after what you did for me. Call it a debt. Call it stubbornness. I am coming, and you can argue with me the whole way up the grade if it makes you feel better about it." Ada studied him a long moment, the rain beginning to fall soft and gray over Cedar Bend's muddy street, and something in her, some tired and lonely place she did not often let herself acknowledge, was glad of the offer even as the rest of her bristled at it. "Suit yourself," she said finally, swinging up onto her mare. "But I will not slow the pace for you, and I will not thank you twice." "Wouldn't dream of asking you to," Dexter said, and for the first time since she had met him, standing in that square with a rope around his neck, he smiled, and it changed his whole face, and Ada found she had to look away and busy herself with her reins before he saw what that smile had done to her. The ride up to Winslow's crossing took the better part of a day, following the wagon road that climbed steadily out of the Cedar Bend Valley into thicker stands of fir and hemlock, the Cascade foothills rising gray and close on either side, their upper slopes already dusted white with the season's first real snow. Late autumn in this country was a narrowing thing, Ada thought, the days shortening fast and the rains coming harder, and everyone from Cedar Bend to the tunnel camps up at Stampede Pass was racing the same clock, trying to move the last of the season's freight, the last barrels of flour and kegs of nails and crates of tinned goods, before the high pass closed under snow and cut the mountain settlements off from the lowlands until spring. Ada's trading post sat where the wagon road crossed the river on a hand-poled ferry her father had built the year they first claimed the land, a squat log building with a shake roof, and a covered porch stacked with barrels and coiled rope, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the darkening sky. It was, she explained as they rode, the only place for 11 miles in either direction where a man could buy flour, black powder, blankets, tobacco, or a hot meal, which made it the most valuable piece of ground in the whole upper valley, a fact her father had understood before he died, and a fact Silas Marrow understood now. "My father came from Norway in '69, she told Dexter as they rode, because the silence between them had grown into something she felt compelled to fill, and because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted him to know her story. He and my mother homesteaded this crossing when there was nothing here but the river and the trees. My mother died of a fever 3 winters after we came. My father built the post with his own hands, plank by plank, and I grew up behind that counter weighing flour and mending harness. He died 2 years ago this coming spring. A widowmaker limb came down on him while he was clearing a burn on our timber lot, and since then it has been myself and my brother Lars, and my Aunt Ingrid who came out from Minnesota to help us, running the place as best we can." "How old is your brother?" Dexter asked. 15. Strong for his age and works harder than most grown men I have met, but 15 all the same, and Silas Marrow knows it. He has offered 3 times now to buy the crossing outright, each offer lower than the last, as though he thinks grief and a boy's youth will wear me down until I take whatever he cares to give me. And you have said no 3 times. "I have said no 3 times, Ada agreed, "and I will say no a 4th and a 5th if it comes to that. My father is buried on that land under the big cedar behind the barn. I did not cross an ocean and half a continent, and I did not watch my father break his back building that post plank by plank, to hand it over to a man who wants it only to choke off every farm and camp above him and charge whatever toll he pleases for the privilege of crossing his river." Dexter was quiet for a moment, his horse's hooves striking soft and rhythmic on the wet road. "I understand something about wanting to hold onto ground that costs a person dear to keep," he said finally, and there was a shadow in his voice that made Ada glance over at him, curious, but he did not elaborate, and she did not press, though she filed the moment away, a small locked door she noted the shape of without yet trying the handle. They reached Winslow's crossing as the last gray light was failing, and Ada felt the particular loosening in her chest that she always felt coming home, even now with a stranger riding beside her. Lars came out onto the porch at the sound of hooves, a lanky boy with his sister's fair hair and their father's steady eyes, a rifle held loose but ready in his hands until he recognized Ada's mare and let it drop to his side. "You are late," he said, relief plain under the scolding tone he was clearly trying for. "Aunt Ingrid has been fretting since yesterday noon." "I am later than I planned, but I have brought help," Ada said, dismounting stiffly. "Lars, this is Mr. Dexter Bishop, the Northern Pacific Scout. He is the man I rode to Cedar Bend to save from the gallows, and it seems he has decided to repay the favor by making himself useful around here for a while." Lars looked Dexter over with the frank appraisal of a boy sizing up a man, taking in the breadth of his shoulders, the way he sat a horse, the calm and steady way he met the look without flinching. "You any good with an axe?" Lars asked finally. "Better with a rifle and a compass," Dexter said, "but I have split my share of wood in my time. I imagine I will earn my keep." Aunt Ingrid, a broad, capable woman with iron-gray hair pinned severely back and flour still dusted on her forearms, appeared in the doorway with a lantern and looked Dexter over with rather more suspicion than her nephew had, though she softened somewhat once Ada had told the story of the gallows over a hasty supper of venison stew and dark bread. The four of them crowded around the trading post's single long table, while rain began to drum steadily on the shake roof outside. "So the railroad man stays," Ingrid said at last. In the heavily accented English she had never quite smoothed the edges from despite 20 years in America. "In the barn, I think, not the house. Whatever debt he owes Ada, he can pay it from a respectful distance." "The barn suits me fine, ma'am," Dexter said gravely, though Ada caught the flicker of amusement at the corner of his mouth and found herself fighting not to smile at it herself. That first night, lying awake in the small room off the trading post's main hall that had been hers since childhood, Ada listened to the rain and turned the day over in her mind. She had ridden into Cedar Bend prepared to save a stranger's life and nothing more, expecting to hand her evidence to the law and ride home unchanged. Instead, she found herself lying awake thinking of a man's face lit with disbelieving gratitude at the base of a gallows, of the low rasp of his voice, of the stubborn set of his jaw when he told her he would not let her ride home alone. She did not know yet what to make of Dexter Bishop, only that something in her, some tired and guarded corner that had shouldered the whole weight of the crossing alone since her father died, had felt, however briefly, less alone with him riding beside her. She told herself sternly that it meant nothing, that gratitude was not the same as anything deeper, and she made herself go to sleep before she could examine the thought too closely. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Ada with how naturally it settled. Dexter proved as good as his word about earning his keep. He split and stacked cordwood enough to see the post through the winter in the space of 4 days, mended the sagging corner of the barn roof before the next rain could rot the beam further, and spent long hours with Lars going over the ferry's pulley system and lines, teaching the boy knots Ada had never learned herself. Sailor's knots, he said, he had picked up scouting along the Columbia in his younger years. He was easy with Lars in a way that Ada noticed and appreciated more than she let on, patient with the boy's questions, willing to let him try and fail at splitting a log rather than simply doing it for him. And she saw in it the kind of steady, unhurried confidence that came from a man who had done real work in hard country and did not need to prove it to anyone. He was also, she came to learn with some exasperation, entirely too willing to place himself between her and any hint of danger, a habit that struck sparks against her own fierce independence more than once in those first weeks. The first real trouble came 10 days after they arrived home, on a morning when a Northern Pacific supply wagon failed to appear at the crossing on its scheduled run up to the tunnel camp at Stampede Pass. Dexter, uneasy, rode out along the grade road to look for it, and found the wagon overturned in a ditch a mile short of the crossing, its team of mules cut loose and gone, its cargo of blasting powder and provisions scattered and half-looted, and the teamster, an older man named Foss, lying in the brush with a broken arm and a story about masked riders who had come out of the timber at dusk the evening before. They knew exactly what wagon to hit and exactly what to take, Dexter told Ada grimly that evening, after he and Lars had brought Foss back to the post on a litter, and Ingrid had set the arm as best she could with splints of cedar and strips of torn sheet. That was Marrow's doing. He means to choke the supply line to the tunnel camp before winter closes the pass, drive the price of everything sky high, and make it look like road agents did it rather than his own hired men. And he means to make my crossing look unsafe to use in the bargain, Ada said, understanding rising cold in her chest. If freighters believe the road above Winslow's crossing is not secure, they will refuse the run, and the tunnel crews will go hungry and cold before the season is out, and everyone will blame the crossing rather than the man who arranged it. Which is exactly why I am not leaving you to face down armed riders on your own account while I go chasing after wagons, Dexter said, and there it was again, that flare of protectiveness that made Ada's spine stiffen even as some traitorous part of her chest warmed at it. I have faced down worse than armed riders alone, Mr. Bishop, she said. I faced down a Cedar Bend judge and half a crowd of loggers with a bloody knife in my hand not 3 weeks past. I do not need you standing over me like I am made of spun glass. I never said you were made of glass, Dexter said, an edge of frustration creeping into his own voice now. I said I am not leaving you to face it alone, which is a different thing entirely. There is no shame in 2 people standing together against a man with more money and more guns than either of us has on our own, Ada. I have seen what happens to lone holdouts in a fight like this one. I have seen it up close, and I will not stand by and watch it happen to you if I have any say in the matter. Something in the way he said it, the raw edge under the words, made Ada pause and look at him more closely, and she saw again that shadow she had noticed on the road up from Cedar Bend, some old grief or guilt he carried close and would not yet show her the shape of. "What is it you have seen, Dexter?" she asked, quieter now. "You speak like a man who has watched this exact thing happen before." He looked away from her, out through the trading post's small window at the darkening yard, and for a long moment she thought he would not answer at all. "I was not always a railroad scout," he said finally. "Before I came west to work for the Northern Pacific, I spent some years in Montana Territory, riding for a cattle association during the range troubles. There was a family, homesteaders, sheep folk who had settled ground the association wanted for open range. I was young and I needed the wage, and I told myself I was only there to move them along, not to hurt anyone. But men like the ones who hired me do not send riders out to ask nicely, Ada. There was a fire, and a man died in it, a father with children, and I was there when it happened. And I did not light the match myself, but I did not stop it either, and I have carried that on my conscience every day since." Ada sat very still, absorbing this, feeling something complicated move through her, not quite anger, not quite disappointment, something more like the vertigo of ground shifting beneath a house she had thought stood on solid rock. "Why did you not tell me this sooner?" she said finally. "Because I was ashamed," he said simply. "Because I have spent 5 years trying to be a different man than the one who rode with that association, and I did not want you looking at me and seeing only that man, not after everything you did to save my life. I am telling you now because you asked, and because I would rather you hear the truth from me than piece it together some other way and think I meant to deceive you." It was, Ada thought, a fair answer, an honest one, and she respected the honesty even as the story itself troubled her deeply. She had lost her own father to hard, unglamorous frontier tragedy, had built her whole adult life on the principle that a person's word and a person's deeds ought to match, plain and without hidden corners, and here was a man confessing that he had once stood by while a family burned. "I need to think on that," she said at last. "I am not going to pretend it does not sit heavy with me, Dexter. But I thank you for telling me plainly rather than letting me learn it from someone with an interest in twisting it against you." "That is all I can ask," he said, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, as though he had been braced for a harder blow than the one she had given him. They did not speak of it again that night, but Ada found her thoughts circling it long after the lamps were out, turning the shape of the man over in her mind, the shame in his voice, the steadiness with which he had told her the worst of himself rather than let her discover it in shadow. She thought of her own father, who had told her once that the measure of a man was not whether he had ever done wrong, for every man alive had done wrong at some point, but whether he had the courage to name it plainly when the moment called for honesty. By that measure, she thought, drifting finally toward sleep, Dexter Bishop had passed a harder test than most men ever faced. The peace of that resolution did not last long. Barely a week later, on a gray afternoon with the first hard frost of the season silvering the grass along the riverbank, a rider came down from Cedar Bend with news that set the whole crossing on edge. Cooper Hale, a hired man newly arrived to work for Silas Marrow's timber operation, had been talking loudly in the Cedar Bend saloon about an old acquaintance of his who had turned up scouting for the railroad. A man named Dexter Bishop, who had once ridden with the same Montana association Hale himself had worked for. A man, Hale said with a laugh that had traveled fast through the valley, who had helped burn out the Ostergaard family's cabin outside Miles City with 3 children still inside. Though the children had gotten out alive, more by luck than by any mercy from the riders who set the fire. By the time the story reached Winslow's crossing, it had grown teeth, twisted by retelling until it painted Dexter as a man who had lit the match himself and laughed while a family screamed, rather than a young hired rider who had stood frozen in horror at what his employers had done and quit that same night, never to ride for hire again. Ada heard it first from a freighter passing through for supplies, watched the man's face as he told it, saw the way he glanced sideways at Dexter working near the barn as though sizing up whether he ought to be afraid, and felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the coming winter. She confronted Dexter that evening in the yard, the story burning in her chest, and she saw immediately from the look on his face that he had already heard it too, had probably heard it from Coop Hale himself, who had ridden past the crossing that very afternoon with a smile like a knife and made certain Dexter saw him do it. "Is it true," Ada asked, "that there were children in that cabin?" "There were," Dexter said, and his voice had gone flat and careful in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. "I told you a fire and a man dead, and I have carried the guilt of it every day since, but I did not tell you every detail because the detail of children screaming in a burning cabin is not a thing I can speak of easily even now, 5 years on. I did not light that fire, Ada. I fought another rider for the torch and lost, and I dragged 2 of those children out through a window with my own hands while the roof came down behind me, and their father did not make it out, and I have never in my life stopped hearing the sound he made. I quit the association that same night and I have not touched a gun for hire since. But I did not stop it from happening in the first place, and that failure sits on me every single day, and I did not know how to say all of that to you plainly without it sounding like I was making excuses for something that has no excuse." Ada stood in the cold yard with her arms wrapped around herself, feeling the whole shape of it shift again, horror and something like relief tangled together, because the story Hale had spread was crueler and simpler than the truth, and the truth, terrible as it was at least a truth she could look at squarely. "You should have told me the whole of it before Coop Hale could tell his version first," she said. "I do not fault you for what you did as a boy of, 20 years old caught up in something larger and uglier than he understood. But I do fault you a little for letting me hear the worst version of it from a stranger's mouth in my own yard, Dexter. I told you when we met I would not thank you twice, but I will tell you this once and plainly. I require honesty from the people I let close to me, not perfection, honesty. If you cannot give me that, all the axe splitting and roof mending in the world will not be enough to keep me from asking you to move along. I understand, Dexter said quietly, and I am sorry I let my shame get ahead of my honesty. It will not happen again. I would rather lose you to a hard truth than keep you on a soft lie, Ada Winslow. That is the whole of it. She held his gaze a long moment in the fading light, searching for the lie she half expected to find and not finding it, only a man standing exposed and waiting to see whether she would turn away from him or not. "See that it does not happen again," she said finally, and turned to go back inside, though she noticed, climbing the porch steps, that some of the cold weight in her chest had eased, replaced by something warmer and more dangerous, the beginning of trust rebuilding itself on ground that had just been tested and had, however imperfectly, held. The Marrow family did not wait long to press their advantage once word of Dexter's past had spread through Cedar Bend. Judge Corwin, acting on a petition filed by Silas Marrow's lawyer, issued a notice within the week claiming that Ada's father had left an unpaid timber tax assessed against the crossing land some 8 years prior, a debt Ada had never heard of in her life, and which, conveniently, the court records supporting it had somehow been misfiled until now. The notice demanded payment in full within 30 days or the land and all improvements upon it, including the trading post itself, would be seized and sold at public auction to satisfy the debt. An auction, everyone in the valley understood without needing to be told, that Silas Marrow would be the only serious bidder to attend. Ada read the notice twice at her kitchen table by lamplight, her hands steady even as fury burned hot behind her ribs, while Dexter and Lars and Aunt Ingrid watched her in tense silence. "He is coming at me from every side he can find," she said finally. "First the road agents to frighten off the freighters. Then Coop Hale's poison talk to try to turn me against the one man who has stood beside me through this. Now a manufactured debt from a court he owns outright. He means to have this crossing before the pass closes for winter, one way or another. Then we do not let him," Dexter said. "We ride to Ellensburg and put this notice in front of Marshal Reeves." A tax assessment that surfaces 8 years late, right after a public humiliation in Corwin's own courtroom, is exactly the kind of pattern a territorial marshal takes note of. Reeves is 3 days' ride away in good weather, and the weather is not good, Ada said. By the time he could act on it, if he acts on it at all, the 30 days will have run out and Marrow will have his auction. It was Lars, uncharacteristically quiet through the whole conversation, who spoke up next, his young face set with a determination that reminded Ada painfully of their father. "Then we do not wait on the marshal alone. We call the valley together. Every farm, every logging camp, every ferry family between here and the tunnel has dealt with Marrow's mill cheating them on scale, or his teamsters running roughshod over the road, at one time or another. If enough of us stand up together and say what we know, Corwin cannot pretend the whole county is blind to what his court has become." Ada looked at her brother with something fierce and proud rising in her chest. "When did you get so wise, little brother?" "I have been listening to you argue with Mr. Bishop for 3 weeks, Lars said, with the ghost of a grin that eased some of the tension in the room. "A person picks things up." Over the following days, Ada and Dexter rode the length of the upper valley together, from the small dairy farms along the river bottoms to the rough logging camps higher on the slopes, gathering testimony and grievances the way Ada had once gathered evidence to save Dexter's life. They found no shortage of anger waiting to be given voice. A dairy farmer named Petrov, whose accent matched Aunt Ingrid's own Nordic cadences, told them how Marrow's mill routinely shorted the scale on logs he sold them for lumber, cheating him of 1/3 of his fair payment and daring him to complain to a judge who would only laugh him out of the courthouse. A widow running a small camp store near the tunnel works told of Merrow's teamsters blocking the road for hours at a time to force smaller freighters to sell their goods to the Merrow Company store at a fraction of their worth. A foreman at the tunnel camp itself, speaking low and nervous with an eye on the woods around them, confirmed that timber billed to the Northern Pacific by Merrow's mill routinely exceeded what was actually delivered by a considerable margin, and that Whitfield, the murdered inspector, had been closing in on proof of exactly that fraud in the weeks before his death. Each conversation deepened the picture of a man who had built a private kingdom out of intimidation and a captured court. And each conversation also, Ada noticed with a warmth she was no longer trying quite so hard to suppress, deepened something between herself and Dexter. He had a scout's gift for reading a room and a person both, knowing when to press a nervous witness gently and when to let silence do the work instead. And she found herself watching him work with something close to admiration, an admiration that sat easily alongside the physical awareness she had been trying to ignore since the day she pulled him down off that gallows platform. It was on the ride back from the tunnel camp, the two of them alone on the narrowing grade road with dusk coming down early and cold through the firs, that the tension between them finally broke into something spoken aloud rather than merely felt. "You have not once in 3 weeks asked me to turn back or leave the harder work to you," Ada said, watching the way his breath fogged in the cooling air. "Every man I have known since my father died has assumed sooner or later that I ought to be shielded from the difficult parts of this life. You have not done that. You argue with me plenty, Dexter Bishop, but you have never once tried to send me home to sit by the fire while you handle the danger alone. Would it have worked if I had tried?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "No," she admitted, and found herself smiling back despite the cold and the weariness of a long day. "It would not have worked at all. But I have noticed you did not try, and I wanted you to know that I noticed it, and that it matters to me." Dexter was quiet a moment, his horse's hooves striking soft in the mud of the road. "I spent 5 years after Montana believing I did not deserve to stand beside anyone worth standing beside," he said finally. "Telling myself the kindest thing I could do for a good woman if I ever met one was to keep my distance and let her go on not knowing what I had been part of. Then I met a woman who rode through the night to save a stranger's life with a bloody knife in her saddlebag, and I found I did not want to keep my distance from her at all, whatever that made me. I have tried to earn the right to stand beside you honestly, Ada, rather than simply asking for it. I hope it has shown." "It has shown," Ada said softly, and reined her mare in close enough that their knees nearly touched, the two horses walking flank to flank in the narrowing dusk. "I will tell you something else plainly, since you have taught me the value of plain speaking these past weeks. I did not expect, riding to Cedar Bend that night, to come home with anything more than a clear conscience. I did not expect to come home half in love with the man I saved." Dexter reached across the gap between the horses and found her hand where it rested on the pommel, his fingers cold from the ride but his grip warm and sure. "Half in love," he said. "I have been the whole way there since the moment you climbed down off that horse and put a murder weapon in Judge Corwin's face without so much as a tremor in your hands. I did not think a man in my position had any right to say so, but I am done letting shame keep me from honest words, Ada Winslow, and so I am saying it now. I love you. Whatever comes of Merrow and his court and his hired men, I wanted you to know that plainly, out loud, before any of it goes further." Ada felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight for 2 long years of shouldering a father's death and a brother's welfare, and a homestead survival entirely alone, and she leaned across the space between their horses and kissed him, brief and cold-lipped and utterly certain, there on the darkening grade road with the first snow of the season beginning to sift down soft through the black branches overhead. "I love you too," she said, when they parted, her breath mingling with his in the cold air. "God help us both, I do." They rode the rest of the way back to the crossing in a silence that had nothing uneasy in it at all, And if Aunt Ingrid noticed when they arrived the particular brightness in her niece's eyes, she said nothing beyond setting an extra log on the fire and humming an old Norwegian hymn under her breath while she finished the evening's cooking. The tenderness of that ride did not last unchallenged for long. 3 days later, Silas Marrow made his boldest move yet. Word came down from Cedar Bend that Judge Corwin, at Marrow's urging, had ruled the 30-day tax notice enforceable immediately rather than at the end of its stated term, citing a supposed risk that Ada might attempt to sell or encumber the property before the debt could be collected. An accusation with no basis, in fact, but one that Corwin's captured court accepted without question. More alarming still, the ruling authorized Marrow's men to take physical possession of the crossing, including the ferry itself, within 5 days, to secure the county's interest in the disputed property pending auction. "He means to seize the ferry before winter locks the pass," Dexter said grimly, reading the notice a rider had brought up from town. "Whoever controls that crossing controls the last supply route to the tunnel camp and every farm above here until spring thaw. He is not just after your land anymore, Ada. He means to control the whole valley's access to the mountains, and he means to do it before the marshal or anyone else outside this county can intervene." "Then we do not let 5 days pass quietly," Ada said, and there was a hard, clear resolve in her voice that Dexter had come to recognize as the sound of her deciding something irrevocable. "We have spent 2 weeks gathering every honest grievance in this valley against that man. It is time to bring them together in one place, where Corwin and Marrow cannot pretend not to see them, and we do it at the crossing itself, on the day his men come to take the ferry." The 5 days that followed passed in a blur of urgent preparation. Ada and Dexter rode out again to every farm and camp they had visited before, this time not merely gathering testimony but asking outright for bodies, for men and women willing to stand together at Winslow's crossing on the appointed day and make Silas Marrow's seizure a public spectacle rather than a quiet backroom theft. The response surprised even Ada, who had lived long enough in this valley to know how thoroughly fear could silence a community. Farmer after farmer, logger after logger, agreed to come, some bringing rifles more out of habit than intent, others bringing nothing but their presence and their willingness to be counted as witnesses. Sheriff Tate, when Ada rode into Cedar Bend to inform him formally of the gathering, listened with his hat in his hands and a troubled look on his weathered face. "I cannot openly defy a court order, Miss Winslow," he said slowly. "But I have sworn an oath to keep the peace in this county, and I do not believe armed timber hands seizing private property under a manufactured debt qualifies as peace, whatever Judge Corwin's paper says. I will be there. I will not fire the first shot, and I will not let anyone else fire it either if I can help it. But I will be there, and I will see for myself what Silas Marrow intends to do at that crossing, and I will report it plain and honest to Marshal Reeves whatever the outcome." It was, Ada thought, as much as she could reasonably hope for from a man who had spent years looking the other way to keep his badge and his family fed, and she thanked him sincerely before riding back up the grade toward home, toward Dexter and Lars, and the coming confrontation that would decide, one way or another, whether Winslow's crossing would remain hers. The morning of the 5th day dawned cold and clear, an unusual gift after weeks of steady rain, the peaks above the valley white with new snow and sharp against a pale sky. By mid-morning, the crossing had become the strangest gathering the upper valley had likely ever seen, wagons and horses lining the road on both sides of the river, farmers and loggers and freighters standing in loose clusters near the trading post's porch, children underfoot despite their parents' efforts to keep them back, and over it all a tense, watchful quiet, the valley waiting to see which way its future would tip. Silas Marrow arrived at noon with a column of some 15 hired men, timber hands, and a handful of gunmen Ada recognized from Cedar Bend's rougher saloons. Jasper Marrow riding at his father's right hand with a rifle across his saddle, and a sneer that did nothing to hide the nervousness underneath it. Coop Hale rode near the back of the column, and Ada saw him catch Dexter's eye across the gathered crowd, saw something pass between the two men, old history and present threat tangled together. "This is a lawful seizure of contested property," Silas Merrow announced, his voice pitched to carry over the crowd, though Ada noted he did not dismount, staying safely horsed above the gathered valley folk. "Judge Corwin's order is clear. Miss Winslow's tax debt entitles the county to take possession of this crossing pending auction. I would advise everyone here to stand aside and let lawful business proceed." "There is nothing lawful about a debt that surfaced 8 years late the same week your son's murder weapon was found buried at this very crossing," Ada called back, standing on the porch steps with Dexter close at her shoulder, and Sheriff Tate, positioned deliberately between the two parties, his badge catching the pale morning light. "Every person standing in this yard has their own story of how your mill has cheated them at the scale, how your teamsters have blocked this road to force honest freighters into your company store, how your hired men have burned wagons and spread lies to protect a fraud that Mr. Whitfield died trying to expose. I have gathered their testimony these past weeks, and I have sent copies of every sworn statement, along with the knife and the notes I found at this crossing, to Marshal Reeves in Ellensburg by a rider 3 days past." Something flickered across Silas Merrow's face at that, the first crack Ada had seen in his composure since she had known of him, and she pressed the advantage. "You may seize this crossing today if you have enough guns to do it in front of every witness gathered in this yard," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the cold morning air. "But you will not seize it quietly, and you will not seize it without every person here able to swear before a territorial court exactly how it happened. Is that truly the outcome you want, Mr. Merrow? A public taking, at gunpoint, of a widow's homestead, witnessed by half the valley, 3 days after a marshal already has evidence of your son's crime in his hands?" Jasper Merrow, stung perhaps by the mention of the murder or simply by the fear curdling under his bravado, spurred his horse forward suddenly, rifle coming up. "You have no proof of anything," he shouted. "That knife could belong to any man in this valley." "It has your initials carved into the handle, Jasper," Dexter said, stepping forward now to stand fully at Ada's side, his own voice low and hard. "And Sheriff Tate can testify that your father tried to buy that knife back from the marshal's custody not 2 weeks past, which is a strange thing to do for a weapon that belongs to just any man." The crowd's murmur rose again, sharper this time, edged with the particular anger of people who had suspected a truth for a long while, and were only now hearing it confirmed aloud. Jasper's rifle wavered, his young face twisting between fury and the first real fear Ada had seen in him, and for one terrible, suspended moment, she thought he might actually fire into the crowd rather than face what was unfolding. It was Sheriff Tate who moved first, stepping directly into the space between Jasper's rifle and the gathered valley folk, his own hand resting on his holstered pistol but not drawing it, his voice pitched low and steady in the way of a man who had talked down worse moments than this one in his years wearing the badge. "Put it down, son," Tate said. "Whatever you did or did not do at that river landing, pointing that rifle at your neighbors today is not going to unmake it. Put it down, and let this be settled the way it ought to have been settled from the start, in front of a marshal and an honest judge, rather than out here where somebody's child might catch a stray round." For a long, breathless moment, nothing moved. Then Jasper's shoulders sagged, the rifle barrel dropping toward the ground, and Ada felt the whole crowd exhale as one. Silas Merrow, seeing his son's nerve break and perhaps understanding for the first time the true size of the crowd arrayed against him, the sheer number of witnesses who would carry this morning's story to every corner of the territory whether he liked it or not, sat rigid in his saddle for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "This is not finished," he said. "I will have my lawyers examine every word of this so-called testimony, and I will see this land in my possession before the season is out. Mark me. You may see Marshal Reeves before you see this land, Mr. Marrow, came a new voice from the back of the crowd, and every head turned to see Reeves himself riding down off the grade road, having made better time from Ellensburg than anyone expected, flanked by 2 deputized riders and looking, Ada thought with a rush of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees, like exactly the kind of unbought authority this valley had been praying for. I received Miss Winslow's evidence 3 days past, Reeves said, drawing rein in the center of the gathered crowd, his eyes moving over Silas Marrow and his hired column with a cold, assessing thoroughness. I have spent those 3 days taking additional sworn statements in Ellensburg from Northern Pacific officials regarding discrepancies in your mill's billing, Mr. Marrow, discrepancies that match precisely what the murdered Inspector Whitfield had documented before his death. I have also had occasion to review Judge Corwin's handling of several matters in this county over the past 2 years, and I do not like what that review has shown me. Jasper Marrow, I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Railroad Inspector Thomas Whitfield. Silas Marrow, you and your business dealings will be the subject of a full territorial inquiry, beginning with the tax assessment you have attempted to enforce against Miss Winslow's property, which my own review of the county archive shows was fabricated within the past 2 months, not 8 years past as your petition claims. The column of hired men, seeing their employer's authority crumbling in real time before a marshal with deputies at his back, and a valley's worth of witnesses arrayed against them, began to peel away one by one, no longer willing to risk their own necks for a fight that had clearly turned against them. Jasper made one final, desperate lunge to spur his horse toward the tree line, but Dexter, moving with the trained speed of a man who had spent years reading danger on open ground, caught the animal's bridle and hauled it up short before the boy could escape, and Sheriff Tate had him down off the saddle and in irons within moments, Jasper's bravado collapsing entirely into ragged, frightened sobbing that struck Ada, despite everything, as more pitiful than triumphant to witness. Silas Marrow did not resist when Reeves's deputies moved to take him into custody as well, though his face remained a mask of cold fury even as they led his horse away. And Ada, watching the man who had haunted her nights for weeks reduced finally to a prisoner in his own valley, felt not triumph exactly, but a deep, settling relief, the particular exhaustion of a fight finally, truly over. Judge Corwin, when word reached him within the hour, did not wait for Marshal Reeves to come calling. By the time Reeves rode into Cedar Bend the following morning with his prisoners, Corwin had already fled east over the pass road with whatever he could carry, and Reeves, unsurprised, simply noted the flight in his report and set about the work of appointing an honest interim judge from among the county's respected citizens to see the fraudulent tax claim formally dismissed and the crossing's title restored, clean and unencumbered, to Ada Winslow. In the days that followed, the valley seemed to breathe differently, Ada thought, watching the crossing's regular traffic resume with an ease and openness that had been missing for months, freighters no longer glancing nervously over their shoulders, farmers no longer lowering their voices when they spoke of the Marrow Mill. Marshal Reeves, before he rode back east with his prisoners to stand trial, stopped by the trading post one last time to shake Ada's hand and somewhat more awkwardly, Dexter's as well. You saved an innocent man's life with a knife and a steady voice, Miss Winslow, and then you saved half this valley's freedom the same way, Reeves said. The territory owes you a debt it will likely never properly repay, but I hope you will accept my thanks as a start. I only did what any honest person would do, faced with the same wrong, Ada said, though I will admit I am glad it is over, and gladder still that I did not have to finish it entirely alone. Reeves glanced between her and Dexter, standing close at her side with an easy familiarity that had grown between them over the past weeks into something neither of them bothered to hide any longer, and a small smile crossed the marshal's weathered face. No, he said, I do not suppose you did. With the immediate danger past, Autumn's true business reasserted itself with sudden urgency. For the pass would close within days now, the mountain snows thickening with every fresh storm rolling in off the Sound, and the whole valley threw itself into the last frantic push to move freight and supplies before the road became impassable until spring. Ada worked longer hours than she had in months, weighing flour and counting nail kegs and settling accounts with freighters eager to make one final run before winter shut the door. And Dexter worked alongside her every step of it, the Northern Pacific having quietly extended his position as scout through the winter months in recognition of his role in exposing the fraud that had cost the railroad so dearly in overbilled timber. It was on one of those final busy evenings, the trading post's lamps burning late while Ada tallied the day's ledger, and Dexter stacked the last crates of supplies against the coming snow, that he came to stand beside her at the counter, waiting until she set down her pen before he spoke. "I have been thinking," he said, and there was a nervousness in his voice that struck her as almost endearing in a man who had faced down armed riders and a hanging judge without flinching, "about what comes next, once the pass closes and the valley settles in for winter. I do not intend to spend that season sleeping in your barn under your aunt's watchful disapproval, Ada, however much I have come to appreciate her cooking." Ada laughed, setting aside the last of her exhaustion for the warmth rising in her chest instead. "What do you propose instead, Mr. Bishop?" "I propose," he said, and here he reached into his coat and drew out a small ring, plain silver, clearly not new, worn smooth in a way that suggested it carried its own history, "that you marry me before the first real snow shuts this pass for the season, so that I might spend the winter in your house rather than your barn, with your aunt's blessing rather than her disapproval, and so that I might spend every winter after this one the same way, for as long as you will have me." "That is a very practical proposal," Ada said, though her voice had gone thick with feeling despite her attempt at teasing. "Where did you find that ring?" "It was my mother's," Dexter said. "The only thing I kept from home when I went west as a young man. I have carried it through 5 years of trying to become a man worth using it for, and I did not think I would ever find the courage to offer it to anyone until I watched a woman ride into a hanging with a knife and no fear in her eyes at all. I love you, Ada Winslow. Not for what you did to save my life, though I will be grateful for that every day I draw breath, but for the whole of who you are, the stubbornness and the courage and the tenderness underneath it that you do not show many people but have shown to me. I would be honored beyond anything I have earned in this life if you would marry me." Ada looked at him a long moment, this man who had come into her life at the end of a rope and stayed to help her fight a battle she had expected to face entirely alone, who had told her the hardest truths about himself rather than let her discover them in shadow, who had never once tried to shield her from danger by pushing her aside, only ever stood beside her and matched her step for step. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Dexter Bishop, I will marry you, and gladly, and I do not need any more time to think on it than it has taken me to say the word." He kissed her then, there in the lamplit trading post with the last of the season's supplies stacked around them and the first true snow of winter beginning to fall soft outside the windows, and when they finally broke apart, both of them a little breathless and laughing at the absurdity and the rightness of it all, Aunt Ingrid's voice came from the kitchen doorway, dry with satisfaction. "It is about time," she said. "I have been watching you two dance around each other for a month like a pair of grouse in spring. Lars, go tell Mrs. Petrov to start on a wedding cake. We have not much time before the pass shuts, and this valley will want a proper celebration after the autumn it has had." Word traveled fast through the upper valley, faster perhaps than any news since Ada's own ride to Cedar Bend to stop a hanging, and within 3 days, with the pass road still barely passable, and every family within reach determined not to miss the occasion, the whole community gathered at Winslow's crossing for a wedding that felt, Ada thought, standing on the porch in a dress Aunt Ingrid had sewn from her own wedding fabric, carried all the way from Norway decades before. Less like the end of one story, and more like the true beginning of a much longer one. Sheriff Tate rode up from Cedar Bend to stand as a witness, looking more at ease than Ada had seen him in weeks now that Judge Corwin's corruption had been swept away, and an honest interim judge sat in his place. Marshal Reeves had sent his regrets along with a letter confirming that Jasper Marrow would stand trial for Whitfield's murder in the spring term of court, and that Silas Marrow's timber operation, seized pending the outcome of the territorial fraud inquiry, would very likely be broken up and sold off in fair parcels to the very farmers and loggers he had spent years cheating. A piece of news that drew a rousing cheer from the assembled crowd when Sheriff Tate read it aloud. Petrov the dairy farmer stood near the back with his family, beaming as though the wedding were his own daughter's. The tunnel camp foreman had ridden down from Stampede Pass with a half-dozen of his crew, all of them scrubbed and combed and clearly delighted at the excuse to celebrate before the long isolation of winter set in. Lars stood proudly at his sister's side, having been given the honor of walking her the short distance from the trading post's porch to the makeshift arbor of cedar boughs the neighbors had built in the yard, his young face solemn with the importance of the task even as his eyes shone with unmistakable happiness for her. The ceremony itself was simple, performed by the same circuit preacher who normally served the tunnel camp's small congregation, his words plain and warm as he spoke over the couple standing before him, with the mountains rising white and silent behind them, and the river running fast and cold under the ferry landing where this whole story had, in its way, begun. Ada wore her mother's brooch pinned at her collar, the one keepsake she had carried across the ocean as a small child, and she found herself thinking of both her parents as she stood there, of her father's hands building this crossing plank by plank, of her mother's courage in leaving everything familiar behind for the promise of new ground, and she felt, rather than merely believed, that they would have approved entirely of the man standing beside her now. "Do you, Ada Winslow, take this man, Dexter Bishop, to be your husband?" the preacher asked. "To stand beside him in hardship and in ease, in danger and in peace, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Ada said, her voice clear and certain in the cold autumn air, "and gladly, for he has already stood beside me through more hardship than most marriages see in a lifetime, and I find I do not wish to face the rest of it without him." "And do you, Dexter Bishop, take this woman, Ada Winslow, to be your wife, to stand beside her in hardship and in ease, in danger and in peace, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Dexter said, and there was nothing left in his voice now of the shame that had shadowed him when Ada first pulled him down off that gallows, only a clean, open certainty that seemed to settle over the whole gathered crowd like warmth. "I have spent 5 years believing I did not deserve to stand beside anyone worth the standing. This woman taught me otherwise, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving her right for having believed it before I did myself." When the preacher pronounced them married and Dexter kissed his bride to the sound of the whole valley cheering and someone's fiddle striking up an eager, off-key tune, Ada felt the last of the fear and grief and loneliness of the past 2 years lift from her shoulders like a weight finally set down, replaced not by an absence but by a fullness, a home built not merely of logs and river crossing, but of a partnership hard-won and honestly earned. The celebration ran long into the cold evening. Tables set up under the trading posts covered porch groaning with food the whole valley had contributed, venison and salmon and Aunt Ingrid's cake and Mrs. Petrov's bread, dancing that spilled out into the yard despite the chill, children chasing each other between the wagons, while their parents laughed and drank cider warmed over the fire pit Lars had built earlier that day. Sheriff Tate danced, rather badly, with Aunt Ingrid, to the delight of everyone watching. The tunnel camp crew sang a rough, cheerful song in 3 different languages simultaneously, none of them quite in tune with each other, and nobody minded in the least. Late in the evening, when the crowd had thinned somewhat and the first stars had come out sharp and cold above the mountain peaks, Ada found a quiet moment alone with Dexter at the edge of the yard, looking back at the crossing that had been her whole world for so long and was now, in the truest sense, theirs together. "I do not think, the night I rode into Cedar Bend, that I imagined it would end here," she said softly, leaning into his side as his arms settled warm around her shoulders. "I thought I would save a man's life and ride home to the same solitary fight I had been fighting for 2 years. I did not imagine it either," Dexter said. "I thought at best I might live to scout a few more seasons for the railroad and die eventually with my conscience only slightly less heavy than it had been. I never imagined I would find a home, and a wife, and a whole valley's worth of neighbors who greeted me today like family rather than a stranger passing through. That is what this valley does when it is not being strangled by a man like Silas Marrow," Ada said. "It takes people in. My own father was a stranger here once, with nothing but a wagon and a wife and a dream of ground he could call his own. This crossing has always been built to welcome people, Dexter, not to shut them out. I am glad it finally got the chance to welcome you properly." Dexter turned her gently to face him, the firelight from the yard catching gold in his eyes, and kissed her slow and certain in a way that held none of the desperate gratitude of their first meeting and all of the settled, hard-won love that had grown between them since. "Then let it be our home now," he said quietly. "Yours and mine and Lars's and Ingrid's, and whatever comes after, built on ground your father cleared, and a marriage we built honestly, the two of us, standing together rather than either one of us standing alone." "Together," Ada agreed, and the words settled over her like the first true peace she had known since her father's death, solid and warm and entirely hers to keep. Always together from here on. Behind them, the fiddle struck up another tune, and the last of the wedding guests called for the bride and groom to come back and dance before the night grew too cold and too late, and Ada Winslow Bishop, laughing, let her husband pull her back into the firelight, and the music and the warm, noisy embrace of the whole valley she had fought so hard to keep, no longer running the crossing alone, and never intending to again. The snow came in earnest 3 days later, closing Stampede Pass for the season just as everyone had known it would, sealing the upper valley into its long winter quiet. But Winslow's crossing did not feel closed off or isolated that season, not the way it might have in years past. The trading post's lamps burned warm through the long dark evenings. Lars grew another inch and learned to read railroad survey charts at Dexter's patient instruction. Aunt Ingrid taught her new nephew-in-law to make proper Norwegian flatbread despite his hopeless early attempts. And Ada Bishop kept the post's accounts each evening at the same counter where she had once, in a different life, weighed flour for strangers and worried alone over every threat the valley could throw at her. She did not worry alone anymore. When spring finally came and the pass opened once more, bringing word that Jasper Marrow had been convicted of Whitfield's murder in the territorial court, and that Silas Marrow's timber holdings had indeed been broken up and sold fairly among the valley's farmers, just as Marshal Reeves had promised, Ada received the news standing on her own porch with her husband's arm around her waist and her brother and aunt close beside her, and she found she felt no lingering fear at all, only a deep, settled gratitude for the home she had fought to keep, and the love she had found in the keeping of it.